Thank you so much for joining me. Obviously, I know that you're fighting simultaneously a great cause, but a nuanced cause as well, right? Something that doesn't get a tremendous amount of attention. It just so happens that it's something that's close to me because a lot of my family has dealt with gambling problems. And by a lot, I mean, 50, 60, 70%, to the point where you remember when you were a kid, your parents would have friends over, right? Stuff like every one of my parents' friends is a gambler. Most of them to very large degrees. So I kind of know firsthand the effects that it could have, right, across families and personal lives and outcomes, etc. So just to set the stage, do you mind just explaining what cause you're fighting and how you got, how you got into it? Because I think it is something that does not get enough attention in 2024, 2025.
Yeah, of course. So I do two things really. First of all, I co-founded Gamban, which is software that people can download onto their devices, and it blocks access to gambling, and it means that the device won't be able to connect to either a gambling app or a gambling website on that device while it's installed, and it's designed to be as difficult to remove as possible for the duration of the protection someone opts into. So if you have that moment where you want to quit, you download Gamban, and then when you have that urge to gamble, it's very, very difficult too. And that's the real thing that's the crucial thing I think that's changed in recent years is that accessibility to very addictive gambling products. So it's not just about being able to bet on sports or racing. It's now the ability to bet on casino games and slots wherever you are. And I think that's got very, very addictive characteristics, and the rates of addiction associated with online gambling and online gambling on slots and casino are much, much higher. So I've been involved with, the second thing I've been sort of involved with is social issue campaigns to try to change regulation, because it's not just about an individual's predisposition to gambling that causes gambling harm. It's also the way that the industry offers gambling, what we call commercial determinants. The commercial model of the sector, which derives about 86% of its profits from just 5% of its customers, and the conditioning that takes place with things like tailored marketing, push notifications, optimized products, and incentives to bet more than you otherwise would have, that generates that level of harm. So if we can address some of those things through the way gambling is offered by changing regulation to protect people, then people will still be able to gamble, obviously, and that will be available, but it won't be a sector that is so reliant on people losing more than they can afford. And that's something that I've tried to address for many years. I was involved with a campaign to reduce the stake on what were called fixed odds betting terminals in Britain. And they were machines where you could bet up to £100 every 20 seconds on roulette. And we got the stake down to £2 a spin. But it's just this kind of, if you want to advance a responsible gambling agenda, then it's really, really important to have products that reflect that. And the gambling industry doesn't tend to.
No, you said something, you said a lot there. Now, there's a couple of things I want to unpack, but you said something akin to the fact that your app, your software is put in place so that when a gambler, someone who's struggling with gambling addiction, has a moment of clarity, they can install the app and it can prevent them from future actions. That's something that I'm familiar with. Obviously, a lot of the people I know are casino gamblers. And at least in the United States, you can sign yourself out of the casino, right? It's like a self-exclusion sort of thing where you say, hey, I don't want to be allowed on the premises for the next 365 days. So it's interesting because what I've noticed, and I'm really interested in hearing your feedback, is that gambling is like an invisible addiction, right? Where there's no physical ailments generally. It really happens on the financial, personal, interpersonal relationship side of things. But, how can I say this? Because it's invisible, it's almost sometimes invisible to the gambler themselves, right?
Yeah.
Because ultimately what I've seen is when people have problems, they ultimately end up deducing back to, it's my money, I work for it, I can do whatever I want, right? How do you think about that? Because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in your past you had some issues with gambling as well, right? And I'm assuming in the beginning, that was maybe the thought process. But how do you rationalize to someone, or is it as simple as saying, hey, in a moment of clarity, you have to take preventative actions, right? Because it's very difficult versus an alcoholic or a drug addict who's actually physically killing themselves. This is essentially a financial death in a way.
Yeah, I think harm can only be really prevented through changes to regulation,
Right.
and those kinds of upstream interventions. I think when it comes to software like Gamban, that's when someone has already experienced a degree of harm,
Mm.
who are then in a position where they want to entertain that as an option. Because you're right, that's how it manifests. If you try to encourage someone to quit when they're addicted to gambling, then there will be a defiant response, and until there isn't, right? Until that moment where perhaps they've lost all the money they have and have access to, and they want to take positive action, and they're then receptive to self-exclusion or Gamban or whatever it is. But that will, if that's available at that moment and people are aware of it, then it will prevent future harm, ideally. So that's the nature of the addiction too. It's the fact that it's very cyclical, and it's like concentric circles, right? So the first cycle that you're in and you lose all the money that you have and have access to, if you don't quit at that point, the losses will just become greater and greater over time. The circles will become bigger. The depth of the harm will become greater. So it's about, really, I think, from Gamban's perspective, catching people as early as possible in that cycle of loss chasing. So when they do have that session where they lost a lot of money, that they have a barrier in place. So next time they have an urge to gamble, they don't do it. Next payday or whatever it is.
Right.
But like I do agree. Like it's very, very difficult once someone has become addicted to gambling, or once someone is in that cycle of loss chasing, to convince them to stop, right? Because there'll always be the addiction will be very, very powerful, and it will always convince that person to carry on gambling because the mind is addicted to it.
Well, yeah, because they're what do they say? You gotta get yourself out of it the way you got yourself in it, right?
Yeah,
And everybody's hunting for that big score to try to just fix everything, one score to get even, and then I'm done forever, right?
yeah,
But really, it's a negative. It's a negative compounding, not only financially, but generally. What ends up happening, at least from what I understand, is you lose all of your money. Then you start borrowing money. Then you start taking out loans. Then you start, right, and it starts having an effect ultimately to where you can't provide for your family, you can't provide for your children, you can't provide for yourself, and you have a mountain of debt because there is a system in place. And I think this is where Gamban comes into place. There's a system in place that does support this sort of addiction, right? If the gambler really wants to do it, right? And specifically now with all of these trading apps and crypto apps that are essentially trying to, this is kind of like that old idea of the cigarette companies advertising below the counter for kids, right? When you look at trading apps and crypto apps, I mean, clearly they're trying to start getting people in that mindset at a very young age, right? I mean, you have Matt Damon advertising crypto.com or whatever, right? And now, so, I mean, does Gamban have a position on like high frequency trading as it relates to, your iPhone, crypto.com, anything like that? Because in many ways, that trading, taking the Warren Buffett perspective, is essentially just a big casino as well.
yeah. We do we block those because
Oh,
for our users who are already addicted to gambling, they encourage over trading.
yeah,
So if you want to take the Warren Buffett position, you would invest for the long term.
right.
You wouldn't overtrade. You wouldn't be changing your position all the time. And these apps and these platforms, they will make money from the commission on the trades. So actually, the incentives are not aligned with the consumer. And you're right. There's a lot of characteristics that are very similar to gambling platforms, so that they are very much like gambling platforms, and we have to make judgments on whether something is more like a gambling site or more like an investing platform. But usually, where they offer leverage trading, or as you described it, high frequency trading, these are not a good alternative for people who use Gamban, and it's important that they're blocked. But I think that the issue at the moment with the gambling industry is, as I say, particularly in the US, is it's in that phase now where it's trying to grab market share, and a lot of the practices are very similar to the practices that we had in Britain about 10 years ago. And unfortunately, in that context, responsible gambling or sustainable practices just take a back seat. And I think that the result of that will be that the backlash will be significant, because people will be harmed and people will know people who have been harmed. And it's very, very important that in that context, people understand or know where to go for help, and know that there are some things available to help people. And but it's also more, just as important that state legislatures and regulators start to get to grips with this, start to understand that what the sector actually is, what it actually means for the people that they've legitimized it for, which is, it's a sector ultimately that is extractive. It's deriving a huge proportion of its revenues from people who are addicted, and the regulations absolutely have to. I'm pleased to see that the expansion of online casino has been curtailed a bit. Only 7 states have got casino products. I think there's a recognition in the US that casino is very, very different to sports betting and carries a higher degree of risk. But in any case, I think for anyone getting started with gambling, if you start to get addicted and chasing losses, it might seem like a rational thing to do when the addiction is sort of impairing your decision making to try to win your way out of it. It's one of those things, gambling addiction, where you believe that the thing that's caused the problems is the thing that can also be the solution. But the reality is, if you're addicted, the only thing you're going to do is gamble more anyway, even if you did win it back. So the only method of stopping that cycle is quitting.
Yeah, I mean, the only winner is the casino. The only winner is DraftKings, right? Or Caesars, or whoever's actually taking the action, right? Because, again, statistically speaking, the gambler, the player, is at odds, right? I mean, there's actually statistically over a given time period, there's actually no chance that you can end up on top. I mean, maybe if you're playing poker or, against, essentially you're gambling in a game that's not against the house and you're a skilled player. But to your point, and I think, as we're having this conversation, I think that's where the regulation comes into play, right? Is because there's just not a lot of information about how these games are designed, right? And how these platforms are designed to have you link your bank account, to have you link your debit card, to have you put your credit card on file, and then if you charge 500, you'll get another 250. And they have these ways that are extremely lucrative for them to get you to put up more money, but in fact, it's almost a guaranteed way to lose your principal, right? So how do you? Please go ahead.
Yeah, the wagering requirements, or the playthrough, or whatever you call it. Yeah, I mean, that's crazy. We used to have that here as well. It was so deposit £100, get 100% match bonus, so you get £200 total. Yeah. But in order to withdraw it, you have to bet it 99 times. Well, if you're doing that on any fixed margin casino product, which is what the requirement stated, then the equity value of that would be 0. So gambling should be a risk; it shouldn't be a con. And very often, without proper regulation that protects consumers, they are being exploited. It's not just about preventing addiction. It's actually about regulation, about like making sure there's a level playing field, because already you've licensed a platform or a product that is unfair by its nature, because there's a house advantage, right? So if you're going to do that, make sure that the way it's offered is not, compound unfair on a compound level, right? You've got to at least have a chance of winning. Right. Obviously, you can't on casino games in the long term. So therefore, what kind of stake limits or protections can you put in place to ensure people don't lose too much? Or
Mhm.
with sports betting, for example, if people start winning, make sure they don't get restricted by the platforms, which is kind of what's happened in the US now already. People who, the sharps, as they call them, getting like bets restricted. We have it here as well. So if you're advertising something as a way of potentially winning money and you're not offering people the opportunity to do that, that's false advertising. And this is the consequence, I think, of poor regulation, a very low standard of regulation.
And would you say the social acceptance, because at least in the United States, gambling's never been more popular, right? I mean, at least I remember when I was a kid, well, because there's no accessibility, right? But now with all of the accessibility, there comes a social acceptance to it, right? It's kind of like tattoos, right? Like 40 years ago, nobody was getting tattoos. And then over time, it just became more socially accepted. But this seems to be even on a whole nother level because there is such a consequence. But we have seen that transition. Do you think the social acceptance is directly correlated to the lack of regulation, or at least good consumer information to know the risks? Right. I mean, even cigarettes have a Surgeon General's warning. Right. So I do you think there should be stuff like that in place? Because what it sounds like is you don't think there should be zero gambling within the society, right? I mean, there is a place for it, but there has to be mechanisms in place so that you don't lose your house and lose your wife and kids.
Yeah, I think there should be legal provision for those that want to gamble. But the idea that we should be encouraging more people to gamble or having a set of policies that de facto do that, I think is bad. It's bad for society ultimately because that's effectively where we got to in Britain with the last 2000, with the 2005 Gambling Act. It's effectively meant government policy is to encourage more people to gamble, which is crazy, really. I mean, it's not something that should be prohibited. Absolutely not. But if you look at the commercial model of the sector, if you look at the practices, if you look at the harms that are caused, it shouldn't. People should be able to gamble if they want, but it shouldn't be encouraged to the extent that it's normalized. And I think that's what you're describing is that there's a kind of hyper normalization taking place now in the US where it's becoming very much part of culture, part of mainstream society. And that is, I think, normal in given where the US is in terms of the market. It's the honeymoon period. This is what happens. It's a novel thing. People get excited about it. But that always leads to a backlash and some sense of buyer's remorse. And I think that we're not far away from that now. I think there's also a lot of other issues in the US that need to be reconciled, like the prediction platforms as well, the sweepstakes as well, and there's lots of. I think you mentioned it, like the leverage trading apps and the frictionless kind of platforms that encourage over trading. All of these things are kind of gambling derivative platforms, right? So how do you regulate all of those in a coherent way? Is there a role for the federal government, for example? I saw on one of these prediction sites where you can, bet basically one side or the other, that someone had put a market in for whether the Palisades fires would spread to a certain point. And I sort of looked at that. I was like, if you bet yes, then is that at some stage that will lead to someone actually like sort of generating more fire, right? Like it could lead to really, really
Oh
bad.
yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Or like when's the next assassination attempt, right? Oh, it's going to
Yeah.
be this date, and then you have to have regulation of those markets to protect people who aren't even gambling because they could lead to actually, it's not. This is like taking sports betting integrity to like an extrapolated level to like life, right? So I think that the regulation of that is so important, and what types of bets are offered, not just in a sports betting context, but like just generally, because if we allow markets on things that can be influenced by individuals and by individuals doing bad things that are going to hurt people, then that's obviously not good.
Yeah, I mean, if you allow markets that are going to incite violence,
Yeah.
right? I mean, shit. I mean, you're going to get that outcome, right? I mean, it's just 100% going to happen. That is ridiculous. I didn't know about those two specific. I didn't know about the Palisades one, but to your point, I mean, look, there is already documented videos of people starting fires. If you add a cash element to that, specifically with in the midst of chaos, something bad absolutely can happen. But it sounds like to me that the work that you've been doing, and I guess the UK as a whole is 5 to 10 years ahead of the US in terms of gambling regulation, and I guess like the law book the law book to put some stop losses in place. So I mean, what do you see for the US over the next 5 years as it relates to trading apps, gambling apps, online casinos, etc.?
I think a lot depends on the new administration and
Yeah.
which direction they go in with this stuff. I mean, obviously there's elements of it that want to regulate big tech, and they see that as an issue. There are also elements. Trump Jr. has taken a job with one of the prediction or sweepstake platforms recently as well. So you might argue that that is a signal that
Yeah.
they're relaxed about this stuff. But you could also say that this is, there's a need for federal regulation of that. So therefore, is there a need for federal regulation of sports betting? Like, I think all of these things are very dependent on the direction of travel of the next administration, which I think is relatively unpredictable in many many
Yeah.
contexts. But I think certainly the conditions will be there in the next 2 to 3 years for a significant backlash. I think the seeds are already being sown for that. And it's inevitable as a result of industry practices. And this is the point I always make. I've been a campaigner trying to reform gambling for the last 12 years. And I get they sort of elevate me to some extent by saying like, it's because of campaigners that, they've sort of turned everyone against the industry. It's just not really the case, right? I mean, I'm flattered that they think I've got the capability of doing that. It's really the fact that people find the industry practices appalling. They've either experienced them themselves, or they know someone who's been harmed by the sector. And eventually, you harm enough people for a long enough period of time, and you're going to be unpopular, right? It's just inevitable. So this is the thing that's happened in so many different markets. And you're right, UK is sort of 5 to 10 years ahead. I think there's other European markets as well that are even further along the line of regulation than we are. So the Netherlands, for example, doing a lot of, I think, good things. I can't see a scenario where, given the clamber for market share, that the sector is going to row back on its sort of expansion and growth prioritization in order to prioritize consumer protection. I just don't see that happening. So it absolutely needs to be regulators that do that and take the lead on it.
So what does that Netherlands model look like? I mean, is it more of a stance like, for instance, here in the U.S. with cigarettes, right? It's like government, everywhere you go to buy cigarettes, it's like Surgeon General, we do not recommend you smoke, but you have the liberty to smoke if you so choose. So it's like almost the government's taking a stance of, we don't advise you to do this, but we can't infringe on your personal liberty if you so choose to do it. Is that what it looks like in the Netherlands, or have they? What does that system look like?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a good reflection of it. It's not. It's not illegal, obviously. It's licensed. It's regulated. They take action against those that are unregulated, that are accessing the market without a license. They will have limits in place and affordability checks and a single customer view. So if you lose a certain amount with one operator, then that information is taken into consideration if you try to deposit with another operator. There are very, very strict rules, significant fines, and I think a very robust enforcement action against people who breach their license. And that's the crucial thing, is to have regulators that are able to actually take action and, they don't have their hands tied behind their back like the regulator in Britain kind of does. it's very difficult for them to revoke a license, which is a kind of ridiculous position for a regulator to be in. If you've got a licensee or an operator that's breaching its license conditions, you should be able to unilaterally revoke that license. There shouldn't be any issue with doing that. And I think that's where the Netherlands have got it right, is the regulator is very, very strict, and rightly so, because this is a product or a service, or whatever you want to call it, that is very, very different to anything else. It's an adversarial relationship between an individual and a gambling operator. They're trying to take money from each other. And the operator has the upper hand. So you have to have a higher standard of consumer protection. And that's what the Netherlands has understood. So yeah, things like stake limits, things like affordability checks that are effective. There's lots of mechanisms to try to protect people, but it's just understanding that this is a sector that is so reliant on people losing more than they can afford, that without regulation, you can't change that commercial model. So in the absence of it, I wouldn't encourage people to gamble. So it's kind of like the two sides of the same coin, really. Either you have a sector that's sort of safe-ish with good regulation that kind of limits losses, and you can promote it to some extent, or you have a sector that is clearly harming people a lot, and you say, well, we'll discourage people from engaging with it. But at the moment, we've got the worst of both, really. We're encouraging people to do something that is, in the way it's set up, quite harmful.
This also almost reminds me of the sugar industry. It's like, there's this mask, the food pyramid has masked the fact that, eating too many carbohydrates and sugars, et cetera, is literally causing all of our diseases and obesity. But, FDA, nobody has made any changes, and we just think that it's okay. Right. And the majority, at least the American diet, I think 80% of it is carbohydrates. But there's no real government backstop or intervention saying, hey, you have to do this stuff in moderation.
Yeah.
Right. And I think you mentioned affordability checks. Is that based on income? So literally, in order to gamble in the Netherlands, you have to have proof of funds, essentially.
Yeah, it's to use information derived through open banking to determine whether someone is getting into debt while they're gambling with you. I mean, there's loads of checks that take place on people in lots of different circumstances, such as if you were to try to get a car loan or a mortgage, or, that when you have a financial transaction, affordability is a criteria, and that's taken into consideration your ability to repay the loan. So if you're wanting to gamble a lot of money, and the operator is in a position to be able to make a judgment on whether that is appropriate for you, then they should have to do that. That should be part of the license conditions. I mean, this has always been the case with the gambling industry. They always have pretended or have said that if they think someone's gambling too much, they'll have a chat with them, they'll interact, and they'll encourage them to not gamble anymore. Well, instead of just doing that through optics, which you can't when it's online, why not have access to this information, income, gambling expenditure through open banking, and make a judgment call based on that? And that's basically where the Netherlands are. So at certain loss thresholds, I think it's €500 a month, there is an affordability check, and €500 a month, is way, that's way above the median disposable income, or what people would, spend on gambling on average. So it's only really impacting those that are most likely to be experiencing gambling harm. And obviously some of those will be people that can afford it, and great, they've got that information and they can carry on if they want to. But lots and lots of people are getting addicted to gambling and experiencing significant financial harm as a result of it. And that financial harm that it's causing, because they're getting into debt, is compounding the addiction. It's exacerbating their propensity to gamble more. It's inhibiting their ability to quit gambling. So it's an upstream intervention. And if it's done correctly, if prevention policies are done properly, an individual won't get into significant financial harm in the short term. In the long term, they may be even more valuable to that gambling operator. If it was done properly, they could theoretically be a long-term customer, which is this is what the gambling industry says they want. it's similar to kind of the tobacco industry. They say, well, we don't want people to die because we want people to smoke till forever, right? But it's kind of like you've got a product at the moment that is not conducive to that. You've got a product at the moment that is, in the context of smoking, causing cancer and smoking-related illnesses. And in the context of gambling, causing people to lose a huge amount of money in a short period, and then self-excluding, and then you lose that person forever. So change the product and change the way people engage with it.
Now, so I mean, would Gamban even be necessary in the Netherlands with the regulation that they have? Or so, because it sounds to me almost like what.
Great question. In an ideal world, if regulations were adequate to prevent harm, then there would be no need for Gamban. That's absolutely right. And this is something that, I say quite openly, is that Gamban is, it's not a symptom of good policy. If people use of Gamban in a jurisdiction, and there are some jurisdictions that sign up to Gamban disproportionately to others, it is usually an indication that the prevention policies in that jurisdiction are not adequate because there is demand for self-exclusion. You can reduce demand for self-exclusion through prevention, and you're absolutely correct. However, in the Netherlands, there is demand for Gamban. We are partnered with Locket Cansport, which is the treatment provider, and they provide Gamban for free to people who need it. And we're hoping to build on that. You'll always have, even in the best possible or the best available jurisdiction in terms of prevention policies, there will be people who self-exclude. But my desire would be that something like Gamban wasn't needed. I would be delighted if that were the case.
Mm-hmm. So to me, it seems like the cause makes sense. Right? It seems like everything that you're saying is actually very reasonable, right? From a just a common sense perspective, really. But no doubt, I'm sure you get your fair share of criticisms. So, I mean, what are the most common, or maybe even the most impactful criticisms that you get? I'm assuming a lot of them come from the personal liberty side of things, or is that, or do you ever once in a while get some curveball criticisms that you didn't expect?
Yeah, I mean, I think usually I get personal attacks. That's kind of where
You like Matt personally gets attacked as
yeah.
like a government control shill or something like that.
It's more like I lost lots of money gambling and I want to stop other people doing it and stuff like that. So I'm not a very good gambler, and it's that kind of thing. Like, I don't mind if people want to gamble; it's a choice, right? It's not anything to do with me. I just want to ensure that if people are gambling, they're not being exploited. I'm on the side of people that want to that gamble, on the side of the consumer against the corporate, and the corporates are extremely pernicious, and without control, guardrails, they will exploit as many people as they can in the pursuit of profit. There's no scruples whatsoever. So I do get my fair share of personal attacks. I also get criticized for profiting from addiction because I've got a product that helps people quit gambling, which is an unusual one because I'm not creating the addiction. Obviously, that's the sector trying to deal with it. And as I said to you before, if they don't want me to profit from addiction, quote unquote, then the best thing to do is to encourage prevention policies that mean the demand for Gamban will be reduced.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the price of your product is outrageous, right? So I think it's like $3 or $4 a month. At least that's what I saw in the US.
$3.49.
So, right. So, I mean, that's, it's not, I mean, you could easily price it higher. I'm sure you've had those, I'm sure you found a price point where it's like, no, we need people to get this, where they're not spending, there is a scenario where you could charge $99.99 a month, just as an example, right? I mean, you could charge more than $3.49, but
that's absolutely right. And the people that we're trying to help, they don't have a lot of money usually, right, in that moment where they want to take positive action, but also they don't have a conception of money either because they've been gambling 10 10, 20, $30 a spin or whatever, and they've lost all value of perspective of value of money. That's a symptom of the addiction, is it becomes the disjoint between money and your what you sort of value money at. And yeah, obviously we need it to be a certain level, obviously, because it costs a lot of money to maintain the product. But we also want to make it accessible. And ultimately, the end game in every jurisdiction is for there to be a free option. So anyone, wherever they are in the world, can get Gamban for free and at the point of need. So in the UK, you can get it for free in Finland, in Norway, in the Netherlands, as we mentioned, and in Ohio. So in the state of Ohio, you can get it for free. And we're trying to build on that.
Yeah, so there are arguments about you trying to get rich over other people's off of other people's problems kind of don't make sense in that light.
Yeah.
Right? It's the same thing, man. People who are criticizing in the gambling space always want to be perceived as like an advantaged player. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, have you seen this? Like there's a persona of the advantaged player that
Right.
you want to push out on your podcast or show like nobody has ever won. I mean, it's just, I mean, there's okay, maybe 0.0001% of people, maybe if they have some sort of inside knowledge, it's, something akin to insider trading, but like there is no way to win when the odds are statistically like the myth of the advantaged gambler is just, I mean, it's just all bullshit. Like it does not exist. Right. So I think you're kind of just, you're getting those criticisms from really just a group of people that just have, again, the gambling world, it's kind of based in a certain irrationality where you think you can beat a statistical disadvantage. Right. It's weird. I don't know. It's a weird space, but I do think it's a righteous cause, man. I really, really love what you're doing. I guess my last question would be, I mean, do you see any other sort of hidden problems, within society that need more regulation? Anything that, in your entrepreneurial eye, you're just like, that might be a problem in the next 2 to 4 years, because innovation isn't slowing down, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're just getting more and more on the phones, VR, AR, because I mean, you're going to have a huge battle to fight once those VR goggles come and people are in virtual casinos. So is there anything like that you're seeing that could potentially be a big problem?
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, I think that technology, particularly in the context of gambling or gambling derivative products, is exacerbating the division that already exists between the interests of the consumer and the vendor. So where in a normal sector, there is some degree of market logic, like the consumer wants something, the vendor provides it, it's incentivized to do so at a price that is reasonable, and the quality would depend on the competition in that market, right? So there's market logic that can help in get the consumer a good deal in certain sectors. In gambling, that is not the case. There is no real market logic. So you have to have proper regulation and oversight. And there has to be a degree of policing or ratifying, approving products that are offered to consumers. There should not be, the industry should not be allowed to quote unquote innovate, because innovation is always to the detriment of the consumer. It is to reduce the margins, to extract as much as it possibly can from consumers in different ways. Now, there are products and different types of bets and sort of stuff that consumers may like, and that's good. That's fine. In that context, that would get approval, right? So you might say that that's a form of innovation. But where you have platform innovation and where you have innovation in marketing and tailored offers and different behavioral nudges that are embedded within the platforms, and as you mentioned, like virtual reality and how that's going to change how online gambling is delivered. All of these things require, I think, regulatory approval. And if the system is not set up to do that, then there's going to be significant harm that results from it.
Interesting. You said something there that I just want to double click on. Really, the regulation, and tell me if I have this correct. The regulation is required because the vendor, the casino, is at odds with the customer because the vendor is actually trying to extract resource. It's really an extraction, right? It's not a fair trade of services,
Exactly.
right? So they're putting products in place with terms of service that essentially guarantee the extraction of resources from their customer base. So as
Yeah.
opposed to providing a service where, hey, I need a new shirt, I go to Lululemon or wherever, and it's in a fair exchange based on quality and fit and whatever. This is really a one-sided business practice where the casinos, the DraftKings, even the trading apps are literally crafting product that guarantees the lucrative a lucrative profit and loss statement for them by and pulling resources from their customer base, knowing the effects, right? I mean, the studies are done. Like, people know the effects of gambling and people know the effects of people getting into poor financial decisions. I mean, there's a litany of consequences all the way up to suicide, right? I mean, there's certainly um everybody knows what they're doing. And am I correct in saying that's where or why you believe the regulation needs to come in place?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's all wherever there is wherever there are markets where the interests of the consumer and the vendor are not aligned. And you mentioned food as well. Like, food industry is a good example where
Yeah.
they've manipulated people's understanding of nutrition in order to sell products that are high margin, right, or more prevalent or whatever. Easier to sell from a production perspective. I mean, there's lots of examples of that, and that's where regulation is needed, and that's no more concentrated in any other sector than in gambling. And there are lots of parallels with the gambling industry, with leverage trading platforms, with these types of frictionless apps that allow you to constantly change your position and overtrade and gamble on the price of a commodity or a stock or whatever. That is not good practice for investors, particularly retail investors. Retail investors really should just put the money in trackers, right? And then that's not financial advice, obviously, but like, that's really what the advice should be. There shouldn't be like opportunities for retail investors to constantly change their position. Should be incentivized to you speak to anyone who's invested long term successfully, they'll always say the worst mistake they made, the worst investment decision they made, was picking stocks to invest in and like constantly changing their position. This is the thing. Like, I think we've entered into a realm now where the lack of financial education is being exploited now by these platforms that masquerade as investment sites, but actually they are just offering a form of speculating. And I think that that's going to have significant consequences too. And that's why we block those sites as well, because I think that they are basically gambling by another name.
You have to. I mean, the sites make money off of trade. Like, they literally that's how they make their money, off of commissions from trades. Right. So, I mean, what is it? You show me the incentive, you show me the man, sort of thing. Right. It's like, if they're making billions of dollars or millions of dollars, whatever their profit and loss statements look like, as a direct result of more people trading. I mean, the entire app, everything about their terms of service is going to push in that direction of more trade, more trade, more trade, more margin, right? Because the leverage trading is where people really end up in, so now you're doing 100 trades a day, all on margin. I mean,
Yeah,
statistically, your chance of getting caught up here over the next 6 months is, I mean, it approximates 100%.
yeah, exactly.
Right. I mean, it's last question for me. Gamban. I mean, does it restrict all the way up to like actual bank transactions? Like, can you put a restriction on your bank from sending money to, I don't know, crypto.com?
It doesn't.
Okay.
It is really just about blocking connection to the sites and the apps. So the apps won't load and the sites won't connect. So And as I say, it's designed to be difficult to remove. Now, on the money side, we do work with financial services in Britain on bank transaction blocks, which have a calling off period. So if you want to block gambling transactions or deposits into gambling sites, you'd switch the block on. And then if you want to switch it off, it could be like days or weeks before that calling off period expires and you can do it again. So we do work with the banks on like making that as effective as possible. But it's something that I think is early stages. I think in the US, I'm sure that given the harm that will inevitably ensue from gambling, that banks will want to offer that service, particularly the challenger banks, where it's much easier for them to change or introduce those new features because they haven't got all these legacy systems that they have to kind of figure out how they're going to do it or whatever. It's like Monzo, for example, was the first bank in Britain to do it because it was just very easy for them. Everything was on like new, and they could just introduce that feature quite seamlessly. And I think Monzo has a presence in the US now, so I'm hoping that other US banks will do the same thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll see. I don't know. The United States, for whatever reason, we're always 5 to 10 years in the past. I mean, with the amount of YouTubers who are advertising DraftKings, and it's getting to the point where every major podcast, YouTuber, etc., almost has some something at least tangential to a gambling site. So hopefully it cools down. I don't know. We'll see. Like you said, the current administration as it relates to big tech, maybe. I don't know, but I know for a thing. I know you're fighting the good fight because I know what you're saying is very reasonable and it makes a lot of sense. And I hope that over time, more people adopt your position because I know for a fact, I know from firsthand experience that it makes a lot of sense. So I really appreciate your time, Matt. Thank you for everything.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, this was great.